If you've received an invitation for an MMI interview, then congratulations, that's a huge honor. But at the same time, it's also probably anxiety provoking because MMIs are challenging. Now, the big question that I'm often asked is it true that you can't prepare for an MMI? Because I went on the website of the medical school and they said that you can't prepare, so just relax. So the answer that I would give is that I disagree. Can you memorize prompts and prepare your rehearsed responses? No, of course not. There are literally dozens and dozens, hundreds of potential MMI prompts, and you can't memorize your responses to those. You cannot know what you're going to be asked. But can you prepare? Can you start to prepare? Absolutely. And in this video, I'm going to give you 10 of my expert strategies on how to prepare for the MMI. I'm Dr. Rajani Katta. I'm a practicing dermatologist, and I'm the author of multiple books on medical education and pre-medical guides. And one of my books is the MMI guide, and these 10 strategies are taken from the book to help you prepare and also to help you reduce your anxiety as you go into this. It's definitely a challenging interview, but we're going to help with some of these expert strategies. For strategy number 1 for the MMI, it's really important to learn the kind of prompts that you're going to be faced with when you walk into a room. So just as a recap, the MMI format is going to vary from medical school to medical school, or if you're applying, the MMI is also used in dental schools, veterinary schools, physician assistant programs, so it's used in a number of different professional programs. But I'm just going to keep using the term medical school here. Depending on the individual school, they might have different formats. But a typical format is that you're given 2 minutes to read your prompt. So typically you walk up to the door, you have 2 minutes to read the prompt, and then you're going to walk into the room and you have maybe 5 to 8 minutes, depending on that individual school, in which you're going to be asked to respond to that prompt. So strategy number 1 is to be prepared for the main different types of prompts. The main prompts are the task prompt, the scenario prompt, also known as the acting prompt, and the question prompt. And one of the reasons you really need to be prepared for different kinds of prompts is because if you're not, you might be surprised, shocked, even paralyzed, because some of these prompts are designed to test your poise under pressure. So for example, some of the prompts will have you walk in and have to deal with an angry patient. And I can tell you there's nothing that's going to increase your stress levels more than being faced with a faculty interviewer who is trying really hard to get you to lose your sense of poise. So just being prepared for these different types of prompts is really important. We, in the description for the video, we're going to link to our blog post where we describe these prompts in more detail. And of course, in my book, the MMI book, I give a lot more examples of these types of prompts. So I have 50 prompts with sample answers in the book. But just learning the basics is enough to really get you a lot farther in terms of preparation and in terms of reducing your anxiety. So again, that's task prompt, that's scenario prompt, and that's question prompt. So let me just go over those in a little bit more detail. One type of prompt is known as the task prompt, and oftentimes this is a collaborative task. So one thing I really want to emphasize on the MMI is that schools design these to test for specific non-cognitive qualities. So they might be testing for your sense of empathy, your sense of collaboration, your sense of problem solving. And that's what task stations often are looking for. They're looking for how well you communicate, your ability to work with, your ability to collaborate, and your problem solving skills. So one example would be that you are given a prompt that tells you to walk into the room and provide instructions for somebody else who's another applicant to make an origami artwork piece. And then typically you're gonna have 2 people rating your ability. So one person is focused on how well you're giving instructions, and the other person is focused on how well the other person is receiving instructions. So that's an example of one type of collaborative task prompt. Another type of prompt that you might be faced with is a scenario prompt, also known as the acting prompt. And this is a scenario that's going to be trying to test your sense of empathy, your communication skills, your problem-solving skills, and also your poise under pressure. And examples of this might be where you are walking in and you're faced with an angry customer, you're faced with an angry patient, and you might be asked to play the role of the supervisor or the role of the head nurse. And there are lots of different scenarios, but again, this is an acting or a scenario prompt. So be prepared for some challenging scenarios here. The third main type of prompt is the question prompt. And essentially you're going to walk up to the door and you'll have a prompt on the door and it'll have a question on it. Now that question might be related to current events. It might be related to ethical issues. It might even be a traditional interview question. So it might say, it might say, why are you interested in applying to our medical school? Or why do you want to become a physician, dentist, veterinarian, physician assistant? So it might be a very traditional interview question, or it might be a behavioral interview question. Now, as I'm recording this, it's 2022, and so I think the pandemic is a really ripe area for current events questions. So you might see a question that says, it's a time of intense polarization right now. Discuss the issues around vaccine hesitancy in the United States. And then you would be expected to walk in, you'd have 2 minutes to think about it, but then you'd have 5 to 8 minutes to discuss this with your interviewer. Now, it's very clearly stated that the MMI is not a test of scientific knowledge or clinical knowledge, so you're not expected to be cramming into those areas. But I will say that it's very helpful to know about current events and the basics of medical ethics, because those could arise in an MMI. In terms of the traditional interview questions, you're going to prepare the way you would for a traditional interview. Behavioral interview questions are the ones that start with, tell me about a time when. So it's really important to be prepared for those kinds of questions as well. And we do have a list and we do have blog posts related to how to answer behavioral interview questions. So that's another set to be aware of and to be prepared for. So those are potential question prompts that you might be asked. Strategy number 2 is to make sure that you complete a practice interview before the actual date of your interview. Practice interviews are so important because one of the things we're really focusing on is when you're preparing is you're focusing on the content of your responses, and that's incredibly important. But you also have to think about the delivery. And remember that when we are communicating, that communication is in the form of both verbal communication and nonverbal communication. And it's really hard to get accurate feedback on how you are conveying a message by yourself. So it's really important to do a practice interview, and that could be with a friend, a colleague, a family member, or an advisor. And what you're trying to get a feel for is, how is your verbal communication? So how is your pitch, your tone, your pacing, the speed at which you're speaking? Your use of filler words, because that's a big one in verbal communication. And then you also want to get feedback on your nonverbal communication. How is your eye contact? How is your posture? What is your body language conveying to the interviewer? Is it conveying anxiety, or is it conveying calm confidence, which is what you want to be conveying? This is where a practice interview, where you're able to get feedback on that verbal and nonverbal communication, can be so important. Strategy number 3 is to practice with a timer. One of the most challenging aspects of an MMI is that it is a hard stop, time-bound interview. What that means is that if you're given 5 minutes to present your response to the interviewer, at the end of that 5 minutes, there's a timer that goes off and you are asked to move to the next station. So it's really important to adhere to those time limits. That's why it's so important to practice with a timer. Now at some schools, they will give you advance information about the format of the MMI. So they might tell you that there are 8 stations and you are going to have 5 minutes at each station. If you have that information, that's great. If you don't have that information, typically you're going to expect to have about 5 to 8 minutes at each station. Now, if I were to give you a prompt that said, you are a public health official, tell me how you would combat vaccine hesitancy in your community, you can imagine how hard it is to walk in and to have 5 minutes to respond to that prompt. That's pretty challenging to do it in a structured, well thought out fashion. So that's why it's so important to practice giving these time-bound answers. I will also say that if you have 5 minutes to speak to your interviewer, remember that you want to stop a little bit ahead of time. So you have 5 minutes, but you probably want to plan to speak for about 3 to 4 minutes because you want to give your interviewer some time to ask those follow-up questions. So, strategy number 3, practice with a timer. Strategy number 4 is to recognize that your preparation for these 3 different types of prompts is going to be different. It's also really important to recognize that it's a lot more feasible to prepare for some types of prompts than others. It's definitely hard to prepare for a test scenario or a role-playing scenario. That doesn't mean that you can't take some steps now to prepare though, and I'm going to go over some additional strategies in the next section. The acting scenario or the role-playing scenario is definitely a really tough one to prepare for, but it is really important going into that to recognize that there may be some emotion involved. So oftentimes it's an angry customer or it might be a distraught family member. So recognize that there's going to be emotion involved and really learn the 4 key strategies for when you are role-playing. The first is that you always have to acknowledge the emotion of the person in the room. So start by acknowledging that emotion. That sounds really challenging and it sounds like you're really upset. So words that really make it clear that you recognize that there's emotions involved and you are acknowledging that emotion. The second key strategy here is to listen first. If you think about real life, you're not just going to jump right into problem solving. You're going to listen to what the situation is first. That sounds so upsetting. Can you tell me a little bit more about what happened? So that's going to be really important. Strategy number 3 is to make sure that, or it's to recognize that your verbal communication and your nonverbal communication is going to be rated on how well you're displaying the qualities that are important in somebody in the healthcare field. So are you displaying compassion and empathy in both your verbal and your nonverbal communication skills? I'm so sorry to hear that you've been going through all of that. As opposed to somebody who's just jumping straight to, let me figure out what we can do to fix this situation. It's a different sort of approach, but you want to make sure that you recognize that it's important that the other person in the room really feels that sense of compassion and empathy that you are feeling with somebody in that situation. And then strategy number 4 is to ask follow-up questions. What do you think what would you like to see us do in this situation where you've had a problem returning this garment? For example, if you're dealing with an angry customer. So strategy number 4 is to ask those follow-up questions. And only then do you go into problem-solving mode. So if you remember those 4 key strategies, that'll help you with the role-playing scenarios. But really keep in mind that there is almost always going to be emotion involved. This is not a test of how well you can solve this particular problem. Because really, there's no right answer in most of these cases. It's really testing your other skills, so keep that in mind. Strategy number 6 is to practice responding to high-yield MMI scenarios. I call these high yield scenarios because they're often presented in MMIs. And an example, as I've already mentioned, the angry customer, the distraught patient. You might be asked to break bad news to a patient. So these can be challenging. It's really important to start learning some techniques, tactics, and phrases if you're dealing with an angry customer to start to de-escalate the situation. There are multiple fantastic journal articles written in the medical literature about how to deal with a distraught patient, how to break bad news, how to deal with an angry patient. And in our book and blog posts, we do have links to some of those fantastic journal articles to help you get started. But this strategy, practice responding to those high yield MMI scenarios. Strategy number 7 is pretty straightforward, although it might take a little bit of time to prepare. Strategy number 7 is to understand the basics of medical ethics and to be well read on current events. Because when you're dealing with the question prompts, oftentimes you're going to be asked questions that have some relevance to medical ethics, or rather the principles of medical ethics, or that might refer to important issues that are in the news. So you really need to be well read and aware. Again, this is not a test of your clinical knowledge. It's not a test of medical ethics per se. It just helps to have that background information. So, do you know the 4 basic principles of medical ethics? If you do not, then you need to learn them. And we're going to put some links in the description of this video towards a blog post that I wrote, as well as a few podcast episodes that I've done presenting cases that relate to issues of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So you need to know those basics. It's not going to take you that long to learn the basics, but you need to learn them. You also need to learn about the situations where those basic medical ethics are in conflict with each other, because that's where things get challenging. Also important to be well read on current events, especially related to medical issues. So in the pandemic, I really think that issues related to quarantining, to vaccine hesitancy, to medical misinformation, all of those are really ripe areas for MMI stations. I don't know if that'll be on your MMI, but I think it's really important to read about some of these issues that are really in the news. So this strategy, be well read on medical ethics and current events. For this next strategy, it relates to when you're responding to question prompts. And the strategy is to learn some key principles about discussion prompts in general and to provide a more structured response. So when I say key principles, what I mean is the fact that some of these questions are so broad, and it's also really important to recognize that you're not going to be prepared for every single potential question you might be asked out there. There's just too many. So let's say that you're asked a question about quarantining. The 2 key principles are to put patient care at the heart of everything you do. The second key principle is to think about all involved stakeholders. So it's really important to say that, in this case, I would really focus on patient care, and so I would make sure that I'm taking care of the patient. And that's really important, whatever question you're asked, think about patient care first. But the second principle is just as important, to recognize that it's more than just patient care. There are a lot of stakeholders involved. So you really need to look at this potential issue from the standpoint of not just the patient, but the family member, the work colleagues, the hospital, the healthcare workers. Of course, when you're talking about quarantining, you're thinking about other members of society, you're thinking about vulnerable populations. You might be thinking about not just the healthcare workers, but the hospital. You're thinking about the taxpayers. You're thinking about all of these other potential stakeholders. So 2 really key principles. And then along with that strategy, it's really important to recognize that a structured response is more powerful. So you want to think about really considering what is your opening statement going to be, having an introduction ready to go. If you're giving a body of your statement, it helps to make 3 key points. And it really helps to have a conclusion where you're tying everything up together. This takes practice. Obviously, it's really hard to think about this in the moment. This is where practice helps you. But that's one structure that I think really serves applicants well. Opening, introduction, 3 key points, a conclusion where you wrap it all up. So that's going to help your interviewer be able to absorb the content of your response a lot better. Strategy number 9 is to have some introductions ready to go. So I already talked about the fact that having a structured response is really what you're going for, but it really helps to have some of those introductions that are in your pocket ready to go, so that you don't have to think about the introductions very deeply. So for example, I don't know, but here's how I would go about making a decision in this case. Or you might say, this is clearly a very complex issue, but I would begin by considering the effects on these different groups. Or perhaps you might say, although this issue brings up a lot of strong emotions, I believe it's important to begin this discussion by XYZ. Strategy number 10 is to bring in your own personal experiences whenever possible. This is really helpful when you're responding to a discussion question, because it shows either that you've spent time thinking about this issue or that you are bringing in your own personal experiences, and that's providing you some additional insight into this particular question. So for example, I know that this can be a very complex issue and it can bring up frustrating emotions. I remember when I was a waitress and I had to deal with several very angry customers. So that's one example. Or you might say, I know these are very complex issues. I had a family member who was dealing with very challenging lupus, and I remember having to speak to multiple doctors when we were in the hospital, and this is what I noted about strong communication skills from my physicians. Or you might say, I know medical misinformation is such a challenge right now. In fact, I didn't realize how prevalent medical misinformation was until I was speaking to one of my cousins, and he was talking about his own vaccine hesitancy. And that's when I realized that XYZ. So you can see that bringing your own personal experience demonstrates that you might have a little additional insight. Or you might say something like, you know, I've been reading a lot about this issue because I know how challenging it has been to a number of healthcare institutions around the country. And one of the themes that I've noticed in reading articles about this issue is XYZ. So those are some ways that you can bring in your own personal experience or your own reading, and it can make it a little bit stronger. It's also a nice way to introduce the topic. So it provides, I think, a little bit easier way to structure an introduction. So that's strategy number 10, to bring in your own personal experience or reading whenever possible. So I just wanted to wrap this up by saying that I really want to emphasize one point, and that is on an MMI, there is no right or wrong answer for many of these questions. But there are clearly stronger responses and weaker responses. And obviously there's a lot more I can say about the MMI because I wrote a book on the MMI. But I really want to emphasize that fact, that they're not looking for the right answer, because there is no right answer. I mean, what's the right answer to vaccine hesitancy? We don't know. So there's not a right answer. Instead, what you're being evaluated on is, are you displaying the attributes that make for a strong physician or a strong dentist or physician assistant or vet? They're specifically trying to evaluate those non-cognitive qualities. So don't focus, if you're feeling really stressed out, don't focus so much on the fact that you don't know the right answer. You're really trying to give a strong answer that's demonstrated that you've thought about it, but one that is delivered in such a way that you are displaying those non-cognitive qualities that demonstrate that you would make for a strong professional. So I also want to emphasize that if you're feeling very stressed out right now and feeling like you're not prepared, I can tell you that preparation and practice can make a huge difference. I've seen that in my own advisees, that putting in the time to read, to prepare, and to practice can really make a huge difference. So if you're feeling stressed out, I really want to reassure you about that. So all the best to you on your MMI. Good luck.